Sign the paper, Marcus. Once my ink hits this page, she's yours, and the border dispute is dead. Aaron's voice didn't tremble as he pushed the contract across the rain-slicked hood of the SUV. Lisa stood beside him, wrists bound with a thick nylon zip tie, the freezing rain plastering her dark hair to her hollowed cheeks. She looked at her older brother, searching for a single flicker of regret. There was none. She's just collateral, her other brother Caleb muttered, refusing to meet her deadened eyes. Marcus, the rival pack's ruthless enforcer, snatched the document, a cruel smile touching his scarred lips. The Alpha King will be pleased. What none of them knew, what even Marcus couldn't fathom, was that King David had been hunting for her face in his dreams for 20 years. The heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the asphalt was the only sound Lisa allowed herself to focus on. If she listened to the rain, she wouldn't have to listen to the sound of Aaron's polished dress shoes shifting uneasily on the wet gravel. She wouldn't have to hear the soft, confirming ping of a wire transfer echoing from Caleb's pristine smartphone. They were selling her, not metaphorically, not through some archaic, ceremonial marriage pact hidden behind the veil of pact traditions. It was a cold, calculated transaction executed on the hood of a black Mercedes SUV at the desolate border dividing the Crescent Ridge territory from the Obsidian domain. "Transfer cleared," Caleb whispered, his voice barely cutting through the storm. He shoved the phone deep into his wool coat. He still wouldn't look at her. "Then we are done here," Marcus replied. The Obsidian enforcer towered over them, his broad shoulders practically blocking out the headlights of the waiting convoy. He gestured sharply with two thick fingers. Two men in dark tactical gear stepped forward, their movements entirely silent despite the heavy boots they wore. They flanked Lisa instantly. One gripped her left bicep, the other her right. The grip wasn't bruising, but it was absolute. An immovable force. Lisa didn't struggle. She had spent the last 48 hours exhausting every ounce of fight she possessed. She had screamed in the halls of her ancestral home. She had thrown her grandmother's porcelain vases at Aaron's head. She had begged Caleb, reminding him of the days she used to patch up his scraped knees when their parents were too busy running the pack to care. None of it had mattered. The Crescent Ridge pack was bankrupt, bleeding out from years of Aaron's catastrophic gambling debts and poor territorial management. The Obsidian pack was a titan, swallowing up smaller territories with corporate precision. Lisa was the only asset they had left that King David's people found remotely interesting. "Lisa," Aaron said, finally speaking directly to her as the guards began to turn her toward the idling vehicles. His voice carried a pathetic, practiced edge of sorrow. "It's for the pack. You know this is the only way we survive." She stopped. The guards halted with her, glancing to Marcus for direction. But Marcus merely tilted his head, watching the exchange with mild, predatory amusement. Lisa turned her head slowly. The rain ran down her jaw, dripping from her chin. Her storm-gray eyes, usually so full of warmth and defiance, were flat, hardened into chips of slate. "Don't say it's for the pack, Aaron," she said, her voice a low, raspy whisper that somehow cut through the howling wind. "You sold me to cover your debts. When David slaughters me to make an example of you, I want you to remember that my blood bought your new suits." Aaron flinched, taking a half step back, his jaw clenching tight. Caleb looked physically ill, staring intently at the muddy ground. "Dramatic," Marcus scoffed, stepping into her line of sight, completely blocking her brothers from view. "The king doesn't waste time slaughtering pawns, little wolf. Get in the car." They guided her to the reinforced rear door of the lead SUV. As the heavy steel doors slammed shut behind her, plunging her into the dim, leather-scented interior, the sheer finality of it hit her chest like a physical blow. The locks engaged with a heavy, metallic thud. Outside, she could see Aaron and Caleb already climbing back into their own vehicle. They didn't linger. They didn't watch her drive away. The taillights of their car flared red in the rain before disappearing down the winding mountain road, leaving her entirely in the hands of the enemy. Lisa leaned her head back against the cold window, the nylon tie digging sharply into her wrists. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury afforded to the safe and the loved. She was neither. She was property now, bound for the heart of the Obsidian City, destined to face a man rumored to be more monster than myth. King David, the usurper, the architect of 100 ruined packs. She closed her eyes, trying to regulate her breathing, bracing herself for the dungeon, the interrogations, or whatever cruel fate awaited a hostage of her standing. The engine roared to life, and the convoy surged forward into the blackness of the storm. 50 miles away, in the gleaming steel and glass spire that served as the nerve center for the Obsidian Pack, King David stood perfectly still. The penthouse office was massive, minimalist, and suffocatingly quiet. A wall of floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the city he had built from the ground up. The rain was lashing against the reinforced glass, distorting the neon lights of the skyline below. David rubbed his temples with a thumb and forefinger, trying to ward off the dull, familiar ache blooming at the base of his skull. He was 32 years old, built like a heavyweight fighter, but dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that commanded boardrooms just as easily as battlefields. Yet, beneath the polished exterior of the Alpha King, an exhausting restlessness gnawed at him. For as long as he could remember, since he was a child shivering in the foster system before his pack had found him, he had been haunted by a face. It was always the same. A woman with dark, unruly hair, a fierce, stubborn jaw, and eyes the color of a furious storm. In the dreams, she was always running. Sometimes she was laughing, a sound that made his chest ache with a profound, inexplicable grief. Most nights, she was just standing in the mist, out of reach, smelling faintly of crushed pine needles and sharp winter air. His beta, Elias, had spent a decade subtly scouring the continent's registries. They had cross-referenced photos, utilized facial recognition software, and tracked down hundreds of leads. Nothing. She was a phantom, a trick of an overstressed alpha mind, his pack elders had gently suggested. A manifestation of his desire for a mate he would never find. "Sir." David turned slowly. Elias stood in the doorway, his tablet glowing softly in the dim room. Marcus crossed the perimeter. "They have the girl." The Crescent Ridge cowards signed the papers and fled. David's lip curled in disgust. Pathetic. To sell their own blood to save their skins. He walked over to the heavy mahogany desk and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. Where's they taking her? The holding cells in sub-level 3? Elias hesitated. Marcus asked for confirmation on that. Given her status as the former Alpha's daughter, she is technically nobility, even if her brothers are scum. She's collateral, Elias. Treat her as such until we verify Aaron has surrendered the mining rights completely. David said coldly, taking a sip. He didn't care about the girl. He only cared about crippling Aaron's infrastructure so the Crescent Ridge Pack would finally fold, bringing stability to the northern border. Have them bring her to the loading bay. I'll inspect the merchandise myself to ensure they didn't hand us a decoy. Yes, Alpha. 10 minutes later, David stood in the cavernous, brightly lit underground loading bay of the tower. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and damp concrete. The 3 black SUVs rolled down the ramp, their tires hissing on the wet pavement, and came to a synchronized halt. Marcus stepped out of the lead vehicle, giving a brief, respectful nod to David. "No trouble, Alpha. The brothers couldn't run fast enough." David didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the rear door. "Get her out." One of the guards opened the door. At first, there was only the sound of rain dripping from the vehicle's chassis. Then, a pair of worn leather boots stepped out onto the concrete. David's heart performed a strange, violent stutter in his chest. A sharp, distinct scent cut through the smell of exhaust and wet concrete. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. Crushed pine needles, sharp winter air. The girl stepped fully into the harsh fluorescent light. Her clothes were soaked, her dark hair plastered to her face. Her wrists were bound in front of her. She looked exhausted, bruised, and dangerously cornered. She lifted her chin, refusing to cower, and locked eyes with him. David stopped breathing. The glass he had been casually holding in his left hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. Storm gray eyes, a fierce, stubborn jaw. It was her. The phantom, the ghost that had haunted 1,000 nights of his life. She was standing right in front of him, flesh and blood shivering in the cold, staring at him with a mixture of absolute hatred and grim defiance. The silence in the garage stretched until it felt like it might snap. Marcus and the guards shifted uncomfortably, unsure why the king had suddenly frozen, why the air around them had suddenly grown impossibly dense, crackling with an unseen, suffocating pressure. David's hands balled into fists at his sides. He couldn't speak. The shock was so profound it bordered on agony. His wolf, usually a disciplined, quiet force within him, was suddenly thrashing against his ribs, howling a single deafening word in his mind. Mine. Take the bindings off her. David's voice was dangerously quiet, lacking its usual booming authority. It sounded strained, almost hollowed out. Marcus blinked, clearly taken aback. Alpha? She's hostile. She tried to stab Caleb with a pen during the ride to the drop point. David didn't look at Marcus. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Lisa. He watched the subtle tremor in her shoulders, the way she was trying to mask her shivering by keeping her spine rigidly straight. He saw the angry red line on her pale wrists, where the plastic zip tie was biting into her skin. I said. David repeated, his tone dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying, rumbling vibration of an alpha command. Cut the bindings, now. Marcus swallowed hard, drawing a combat knife from his belt. He stepped toward Lisa. She flinched, leaning back against the cold exterior of the SUV, her eyes darting from the knife to Marcus's face. Give it to me, David snapped, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He snatched the knife from Marcus's hand. Lisa pressed herself harder against the car, her chest heaving. This was it. The stories were true. He was going to maim her here in the garage just to send a picture back to Aaron. She raised her bound hands instinctively, a pitiful defense against a man twice her size. David stopped abruptly, leaving 2 feet of space between them. He realized he was terrifying her. The urge to reach out, to pull her against his chest and warm her, was so violently strong it made his hands shake. He forced himself to remain completely still. Hold still, he murmured. The harshness was gone from his voice. Lisa frowned, thoroughly confused, but she froze as he reached out. He didn't grab her arms. With surgical precision, he slipped the blade beneath the tight nylon strap and snapped his wrist upward. The tie broke with a sharp crack, falling to the concrete floor. Lisa immediately pulled her hands back, rubbing her raw wrists, staring at him as if he had just sprouted a second head. Elias, David said, stepping back. putting the knife away. "Bring her to the penthouse. Use the private elevator." Elias, who had been watching the entire exchange with narrowed, calculating eyes, nodded slowly. "And the holding cell?" "Cancel it." David finally forced himself to look away from her, turning on his heel. "She stays on my floor." Lisa's voice cracked like a whip through the garage. "No." David stopped in his tracks. He slowly turned his head. She was rubbing her wrists, her posture tense, ready to bolt, even though there was nowhere to go. "I know how this works," Lisa said, her voice shaking but laced with venom. "I'm a hostage. Put me in a cell. I'm not playing your sick games in some penthouse." Marcus growled at the disrespect. Taking a step forward, David raised a single hand, stopping the enforcer instantly. He looked at Lisa, really looked at her. Beneath the bravado, he saw the sheer, unadulterated terror swimming in those gray eyes he knew so intimately. She thought he was going to assault her. The realization made him feel physically sick. "You are not a hostage, Lisa," David said softly. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud, and it tasted like salvation on his tongue. "Then what am I?" she spat back. "Aaron sold me to you for $50 million and a strip of logging territory. That makes me property. Aaron is a fool who has no idea what he actually gave away," David replied, his eyes dark, intense, burning with a fierce, possessive heat that made Lisa's breath catch in her throat. "You are coming upstairs because you are freezing, and because if anyone in this garage looks at you the wrong way, I will be forced to kill them. Elias, show her the way." Before she could argue, before she could process the bizarre, protective intensity in his words, David turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the garage. 20 minutes later, Lisa found herself standing in the center of an impossibly large, opulent bathroom attached to a guest suite on the top floor of the tower. The door wasn't locked. Elias had simply handed her a stack of fresh, incredibly soft clothes, pointed to the sprawling shower, and told her to take her time. She stood in front of the massive vanity mirror, staring at her own reflection. She was a mess of bruises and dirt. But what confused her more than her appearance was the lingering feeling on her wrists, where David had stood near her, where his hand had brushed the air over her skin as he cut the tie. Her skin was tingling. It felt warm. It felt safe. She gripped the edges of the marble sink, her knuckles turning white. It was a trick. It had to be. Alpha Kings did not show mercy to the sisters of their enemies. She had to stay sharp. She had to figure out what his game was before it destroyed her. The hot water had washed away the mud and the chill, but it couldn't wash away the profound sense of displacement. Lisa stood in the center of the guest suite bedroom, swallowed by a pair of dark gray sweatpants and a black, long-sleeved Henley she had found neatly folded on the vanity. The clothes were ridiculously soft, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke, the exact scent that had rolled off King David in the garage. She rolled the sleeves up to her elbows, wincing as the fabric brushed against the red, chafed skin of her wrists. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Hiding in the bathroom wasn't a strategy. When she pushed the bedroom door open, she didn't find a cell block or armed guards. The penthouse living area was a sprawling masterpiece of mid-century modern design, illuminated by the muted glow of the city lights pouring through the rain-streaked floor-to-ceiling windows. David was standing by a massive marble kitchen island. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie. The top two buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, and his sleeves were rolled up over muscular forearms. He was methodically arranging silver-domed plates on the counter. He didn't look up as she approached, but his broad shoulders tensed infinitesimally. "I didn't know what you prefer. So I had the kitchen send up a little of everything. Lisa stopped a dozen paces away, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Is this part of the psychological torture? Feed the prisoner a last meal before throwing her in the dungeon? David finally turned. The amber glow of a nearby lamp caught the harsh, architectural lines of his face. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and once again, Lisa felt that strange, breathless stutter in her chest. The sheer intensity of his gaze was suffocating. "There is no dungeon, Lisa," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble that vibrated right through the floorboards. "And you are not a prisoner." "You bought me for $50 million, she fired back, crossing her arms protectively over her chest. "That makes me a captive. Let's not pretend this is a hospitality visit." David's jaw tightened. He picked up a silver fork, speared a piece of perfectly seared steak from one of the plates, and ate it. He then took a sip of the water poured into a crystal glass beside it. "Not poisoned," he said simply, stepping back from the island and gesturing to the stool. "Eat. You're practically dead on your feet. We can argue about the semantics of your presence here after you've had a hot meal." Her stomach betrayed her with a loud, violent rumble. She hadn't eaten since Aaron first locked her in her room 2 days ago to prepare the contract, maintaining eye contact. Lisa slowly walked to the island and sat down on the edge of the leather stool, ready to bolt. She picked up a clean fork and took a bite of the steak. The rich, savory flavor exploded on her tongue, and she had to suppress a groan of relief. She ate mechanically at first, then ravenously, abandoning all pretense of manners. David stood on the opposite side of the island, leaning against the counter, simply watching her. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched her with an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't the predatory hunger she was used to seeing from rival alphas. It looked more like reverence, like he was studying a priceless artifact he had thought lost to the world. "Stop looking at me like that," she muttered, dropping her fork onto the empty plate. "Like what? Like you're trying to figure out how to dissect me?" A ghost of a smile touched the corner of David's mouth, a surprisingly soft expression that transformed his harsh features. "I'm not going to dissect you. I'm just making sure you're actually real." Lisa frowned, thoroughly thrown off balance. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," David sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, "that your brothers are fools. The guest suite is yours. The door locks from the inside. You have full access to this floor. Do not try to access the elevators without Elias. The security system will assume you are an intruder and lock the building down. Sleep, Lisa. You're safe here." He turned and began to walk away, dissolving into the shadows of the expansive living room. "Why?" she called out, her voice echoing in the quiet penthouse. "Why are you doing this? I'm the enemy." David paused, glancing back over his shoulder. The city lights cast half his face in deep shadow. "You were the enemy yesterday. Today, you are under my roof, and I protect what is mine." Lisa woke with a gasp, her hands instinctively grabbing the thick down comforter, expecting to find the cold nylon of the zip ties digging into her wrists. Instead, she found soft linen and morning sunlight filtering through the motorized blinds. She had slept for 12 uninterrupted hours. Panic flared briefly in her chest. She shouldn't have dropped her guard. But as she sat up, the lingering scent of cedar and smoke in the room acted like a physical sedative, calming her racing heart. It was infuriating how safe her wolf felt in the heart of enemy territory. She dressed in a fresh pair of jeans and a gray sweater she found in the walk-in closet, which had inexplicably been stocked with clothes in her exact size. Stepping out of the bedroom, she found the penthouse bathed in daylight. The storm had passed, leaving the city skyline crisp and glittering below. The living room was empty, but a low murmur of voices drew her toward a set of heavy, sliding oak doors at the end of the hall. They were cracked open just an inch. No, cannot simply let them walk away with the liquid capital, Alpha. Elias's sharp, clinical voice drifted through the gap. Aaron transferred the $50 million into a series of offshore holding companies less than an hour after the drop. He is already defaulting on the severance pay for the lower-tier PAC members of Crescent Ridge. Lisa froze, her hand hovering over the doorframe. Her breath hitched. Aaron was stealing the money. He wasn't using it to stabilize the PAC or pay their people. He was funneling it away to save himself. A bitter, acidic wave of betrayal washed over her. "I know," David's voice replied, sounding exhausted but authoritative. "Freeze the shell accounts through our banking contacts. I want every cent locked down by noon." "And the PAC members he abandoned?" Elias asked. "Winter is coming. Without that capital, the Crescent Ridge border towns will starve." There was a long silence. Lisa pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the doorframe, her eyes burning. Her brothers had sold her, and now they were leaving their own people to freeze. "Dispatch a relief convoy," David finally ordered. "Use the discretionary fund. Blankets, food, medical supplies. Send them under the Obsidian banner. Let the Crescent Ridge people know their Alpha abandoned them, but I will not let them freeze." "Sir," Elias cautioned, his tone carefully neutral. "Providing aid to an enemy territory. The Council will view this as soft. They will ask why you are spending our resources to fix Aaron's mess, especially when you already have the sister as leverage." "She is not leverage," David snarled, the sudden, violent force of his alpha aura bleeding through the crack in the door, making Lisa's knees weak. "And I don't give a damn what the Council thinks. A weak leader starves his people to feed his pride. I spent the first 8 years of my life freezing in alleyways because a weak alpha abandoned my birth pack. I will not watch it happen to another territory on my border. Do it, Elias." "Yes, Alpha." Lisa stumbled back from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She retreated to the kitchen, leaning heavily against the marble island, her mind spinning. King David, the ruthless conqueror, was secretly sending aid to the people her own brothers had left to die. And he had defended her to his closest confidant. She is not leverage. Footsteps approached. David walked into the kitchen, freezing when he saw her. He was dressed in a tailored black suit, looking every inch the terrifying monarch he was supposed to be. But his dark eyes instantly softened as they landed on her. "You're awake," he said softly, stopping at a respectful distance. Lisa stared at him, seeing past the tailored suit and the imposing height, seeing the ghost of the freezing, abandoned boy he had just spoken about. "You're sending food to my pack." David's expression shuddered, a wall of cool composure slamming down. He shot a glare toward the hallway. "You were listening." "You didn't lock the door," she countered, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you helping them, David? They hate you. I'm supposed to hate you." David took a slow step forward. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before his knuckles gently brushed against her jawline. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. Her wolf purred, a sound she desperately tried to suppress. "I don't care if they hate me, Lisa," he murmured, his thumb lightly tracing the shadow of a bruise on her cheek. "I only care that you survive this intact." She swallowed hard, her eyes locked on his lips, suddenly acutely aware of how close he was, of the heat radiating from his chest. "I don't understand you." "I know," he whispered, slowly pulling his hand away, leaving her skin burning where he had touched it. but I have all the time in the world to explain. The fragile peace of the penthouse shattered 3 days later. Lisa was sitting in the library, a massive room lined with thousands of leather-bound books, trying to lose herself in a novel when the heavy oak doors banged open. Elias stood in the doorway, chest heaving, his normally immaculate suit slightly rumpled. He didn't look at Lisa. His eyes locked instantly on David, who was working at a mahogany desk in the corner. "Alpha, we have a breach." David stood up slowly, the air in the room suddenly dropping 10 degrees. "Where?" "Sector 4, the Silver Creek Mine," Elias said grimly. "Aaron didn't flee the territory like we assumed. He used a fraction of the frozen funds to hire a dozen rogue mercenaries before the accounts locked. They hit our border patrol 20 minutes ago. 2 of our wolves are severely injured." Lisa dropped the book. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. The sound was deafening in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. Aaron, idiot. He was trying to take back the very asset he had traded her for, likely assuming David wouldn't retaliate for fear of damaging his hostage. He was gambling with her life. Again. David didn't look at her. His face was a mask of terrifying cold fury. The protective, gentle man who had brushed her cheek was gone, replaced instantly by the Alpha King who had crushed rebellions with an iron fist. "Prep the tactical teams," David said, his voice lethal. "I want them surrounded. No survivors among the mercenaries. Bring Aaron to me alive." "Wait!" Lisa was on her feet before she even realized she had moved. Both men turned to look at her. Elias looked annoyed. David just looked tired. "Lisa, go back to the guest suite," David commanded softly. But there was no room for argument in his tone. "He's my brother," she said, taking a step toward the desk. Her heart was in her throat. She expected David to sneer, to tell her that her brother had forfeited his right to live. Instead, David held her gaze. "He attacked my men, Lisa. He broke a blood-signed treaty. He did it knowing I hold you here. He assumes I will execute you in retaliation, and he clearly doesn't care. Do you understand what that means?" The words were a physical blow, validating her deepest, darkest fears. Aaron truly considered her dead already. "I know," she choked out, fighting the tears burning in her eyes. "I know what he is. But I also know the Silver Creek Mine. I practically grew up playing in those tunnels." Elias frowned, stepping forward. "Alpha, this is a security risk. She shouldn't—" "Quiet, Elias," David snapped, never taking his eyes off Lisa. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. The height difference forced her to tilt her head up to meet his intense stare. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Aaron is a coward," Lisa said, her voice dropping to a harsh, steady whisper. She was severing the final thread of loyalty to her bloodline, right here, right now. He won't be leading the charge. He'll be hiding in the secondary ventilation shaft at the North Ridge, letting the mercenaries do the dying. If your men go in through the main entrance, it'll be a bloodbath. It's a choke point. David stared at her, searching her eyes. He was looking for deception, for a trap. But all he found was a profound, weary honesty. She was choosing his men over her brother's ego. Without a word, David reached out and gripped her hand. His fingers were warm, rough, and engulfing. He pulled her gently but firmly toward the center of the room, where a large, flat-screen tactical table sat dormant. He tapped a code into the glass, and a topographical map of the Silver Creek Mine flared to life in glowing blue light. "Show me," David commanded, stepping close behind her, so close his chest brushed her back. Lisa's breath hitched at the contact. the mate bond flaring so violently she felt dizzy. She leaned over the table, her trembling finger tracing a thin blue line on the northern edge of the map. Here. It's an old access grate hidden behind a copse of dead pines. It leads directly to the overseer's booth. You can bypass the choke point entirely and cut off his retreat. David looked from the map to the side of her face. The proximity was intoxicating. He could smell her fear, yes, but beneath it was a steely, magnificent resolve. "Elias," David said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur, his eyes still fixed on Lisa's profile. "Update the tactical teams. Send a covert unit to the North Ridge ventilation shaft. Extract Aaron." Quietly, Elias stared at them both for a long moment. Realization slowly dawning in his eyes as he observed the physical tension, the sheer, undeniable gravity pulling his Alpha toward the Crescent Ridge girl. He nodded slowly. "Yes, Alpha." As Elias left the room, David didn't move away. He stayed right behind her, his hand slowly sliding from her grip to rest warmly on her waist. Lisa closed her eyes, utterly terrified by how perfectly she fit against the enemy king, and how little she wanted him to let go. The extraction was surgically precise and terrifyingly fast. Less than 2 hours after Lisa had drawn the line on the glowing tactical map, the heavy steel doors of the penthouse elevator slid open with a soft chime. Elias stepped out first, his expression completely blank, a stark contrast to the violent smears of dirt and dried blood on his tactical vest. Behind him, flanked by 2 towering obsidian guards, was Aaron. He was not the polished, arrogant Alpha who had stood in the rain 3 days prior. His expensive Italian coat was torn at the shoulder, his face was bruised purple along the cheekbone, and his hands were bound behind his back with heavy, reinforced steel cuffs. He looked small. Stripped of his enforcers and his unearned bravado, he looked exactly like what he was. A cornered, desperate coward, David stood near the center of the living room, his hands clasped casually behind his back. Lisa stood a few feet diagonally behind him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had thought seeing Aaron brought low would spark a sense of vindictive joy in her chest. Instead, there was only a hollow, heavy sadness. "The mercenaries have been neutralized," Elias reported, his voice devoid of inflection. "Caleb was found hiding in the secondary getaway vehicle 2 miles down the ridge. He is currently in holding cell 4. Aaron was exactly where she said he would be, cowering in the ventilation shaft." Aaron's head snapped up at that, his eyes zeroing in on Lisa. The sheer, venomous hatred in his gaze was so potent it almost felt like a physical blow. "You," he snarled, straining against the grip of the guards holding his arms. "You sold out your own blood. You gave them the coordinates." David took a single, slow step forward. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The immense, crushing pressure of his Alpha aura flooded the space, forcing the 2 guards to involuntarily lower their eyes. Aaron's knees buckled slightly, his wolf instinctively submitting to the apex predator in the room. "Watch your tone when you speak to her in my home," David said. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a deadly, vibrating rumble that shook the crystal glasses on the bar cart. "You broke a blood-sworn treaty, Aaron. You attacked my men on my land. By all laws of our kind, I should mount your head on the border gates." Aaron let out a ragged, breathless laugh, spitting a glob of blood onto the pristine hardwood floor. He was terrified, but his narcissism wouldn't let him die quietly. "Do it then. Kill me. But don't act like you're taking the moral high ground, David. You bought my sister like a piece of meat to humiliate my pack. I bought your sister to keep you from selling her to someone worse when you inevitably bankrupted yourself again." David replied coldly. "But you're right. I did intend to use her to leverage the final surrender of Crescent Ridge. That was before I knew the truth. Aaron froze. The manic energy drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, stark pallor. What truth? Lisa stepped out from behind David's shadow. The fear that had kept her quiet for her entire life was entirely gone, burned away by the fires of her brother's repeated betrayals. Why did you do it, Aaron? The gambling debts were bad, but $50 million. You sold me for an empire's ransom. You could have surrendered the mining rights and kept me. Why did I have to be part of the transaction? Aaron looked away, his jaw working furiously. You were collateral. You're lying, David interjected quietly. My financial analysts tore through the Crescent Ridge accounts this morning. Your father's estate was locked under a secondary trust. A trust that only unlocks upon the ascension of the true, named Alpha heir. David tilted his head, his dark eyes boring into Aaron's soul. You needed the $50 million to cover your debts because you couldn't access the family vault. Because you aren't the Alpha. Lisa felt the breath leave her lungs in a sharp rush. She stared at David, then back at her brother. What is he talking about? Aaron sneered, a desperate, ugly expression. Father was an old fool. His mind was slipping in his final years. He thought a woman could lead the pack. He thought you had the temperament for it. He amended the pack charter in secret before the car crash. He named you his successor. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. The city outside seemed to fade into nothingness. You hid the charter, Lisa whispered, the fragments of her life suddenly aligning into a horrifying, crystal-clear picture. The way Aaron had kept her isolated. The way he had refused to let her attend council meetings. The way he and Caleb had constantly demeaned her instincts. You didn't sell me to save the pack. You sold me to the most ruthless Alpha on the continent, hoping he would kill me so you would be the last living bloodline heir. You are soft, Aaron shouted, struggling violently against the guards. You would have turned Crescent Ridge into a charity. I did what I had to do to maintain our strength. Get him out of my sight, David commanded, disgusted. Put him in solitary. We will deal with him at dawn. As the guards dragged a screaming Aaron toward the elevator, Lisa stumbled backward until her spine hit the cool glass of the window. Her entire life, her grief over her parents, her loyalty to her pack, it had all been a meticulously crafted lie to keep a stolen crown upon a coward's head. The penthouse was suffocatingly quiet after the elevator doors closed. Elias had vanished seamlessly, leaving David and Lisa entirely alone. Lisa slid slowly down the glass window until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She wasn't crying. The shock was too profound, too deeply rooted for tears. She was the Alpha of Crescent Ridge. Her people were starving, their assets frozen, their honor stripped away by her own brother. And she had been the rightful leader all along. She heard the soft clink of glass, and a moment later, David was sitting on the floor beside her. He didn't crowd her. He left a respectable foot of space between them, resting his forearms on his knees, a glass of amber liquid dangling loosely from his fingers. Drink, he said softly, holding the glass out. It burns, but it helps. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a familiar, grounding shockwave up her arm. She took a sip of the bourbon. It tasted like fire and oak, and it forced a heavy breath from her lungs. Did you know? She asked, staring straight ahead at the glittering city lights. When you bought me, did you know I was the heir? No, David said honestly, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. I only found out an hour ago when my team decrypted Aaron's private servers. When I signed that contract on the border, I thought I was buying the sister of a foolish rival to secure a tactical advantage. He paused, turning his head to look at her. But that was before you stepped out of the SUV. Lisa turned to meet his gaze. In the dim light, his eyes weren't the terrifying, bottomless black pits the rumors claimed. They were a rich, dark brown, swirling with an emotion so raw and unguarded it made her chest ache. "What happened in the garage, David?" she asked softly. "Why did you cut the ties? Why am I in your penthouse instead of a cell?" David set his glass down on the hardwood floor. He shifted closer, the space between them evaporating. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping her face. He didn't demand submission. The touch was entirely reverent. "Because I have been looking for you my entire life," he whispered. Lisa froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What?" "I was a street rat, Lisa. My birth pack threw me out when I was 4 because I was too small. I clawed my way out of the gutters. I built obsidian on blood, steel, and paranoia. I didn't trust anyone. I didn't believe in the old myths." He brushed his thumb across her cheekbone, his eyes mapping every feature of her face as if memorizing it for a second time. "But every night, for 20 years, I dreamed of a girl with storm-gray eyes and a fierce jaw. She smelled like crushed pine needles and smoke. She was the only warm thing in a world made entirely of ice." Lisa's heart hammered against his palm. The scent he described. It was her scent. Her wolf was practically humming beneath her skin, clawing at the surface, desperate to close the remaining distance between them. The legends of true mates were considered fairy tales, ancient biology bred out of their kind centuries ago. But sitting here, breathing in his cedar and smoke scent, feeling the absolute terrifying safety of his presence, she knew it was real. "When you stepped out of that car in the rain," David continued, his voice thick with emotion, "and I saw you, I thought I was losing my mind. The monster of the North, brought to his knees in his own loading dock by a girl in wet boots." A tear finally broke free, tracking down Lisa's cheek. "I thought you were going to kill me. I would burn this city to ash before I let anyone lay a finger on you," he vowed, his forehead dropping to rest gently against hers. The physical contact shattered the final barrier between them. The mate bond, ancient and undeniable, snapped fully into place. It felt like a tectonic shift in her soul, a sudden, blinding realization that she was no longer adrift. She was anchored. Lisa let out a soft, shuddering breath and closed her eyes, leaning into him. She reached up, her hands tangling in his dark hair. David groaned, a deep, primal sound, and his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. When their lips met, it wasn't a tentative exploration. It was a collision of two lonely, hardened souls finally finding home. The kiss was deep, desperate and electric, tasting of bourbon and tears. All the tension, the fear, the years of feeling completely invisible under her brother's shadows evaporated in the heat of his mouth. He kissed her like she was a queen. He kissed her like she was the only thing keeping his heart beating. When they finally broke apart, breathless and clinging to each other, David rested his hand over her racing heart. "You are the alpha of Crescent Ridge," he said, his voice ragged but fiercely proud. "And tomorrow, you will show them exactly what that means." Dawn broke over the city in a blaze of cold, winter sunlight. The underground holding sector of the Obsidian Tower was a masterpiece of intimidation. Stark white walls, reinforced steel bars, and blinding fluorescent lights left no room for shadows or secrets. Lisa stood at the end of the long corridor, wearing a sharply tailored black suit that Elias had procured for her. She looked nothing like the battered hostage dragged out of the rain 4 days ago. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, the profound power of her true alpha bloodline finally uncoiling in her veins, amplified by the stabilizing, heavy presence of her mate standing solidly at her right side. David made no move to lead. He stood half a step behind her, an implicit, terrifying message to anyone watching. She is the power here. I am just the sword she wields. They stopped in front of a large holding cell. Aaron and Caleb were both inside, sitting on opposite ends of a steel bench. They looked up as she approached. Caleb immediately dropped his gaze to the floor, shivering. Aaron stood up, trying to muster some semblance of his former authority. But he faltered under the crushing weight of the combined alpha auras pressing against the glass. "What is this?" Aaron demanded, his voice cracking. "A mock trial?" "There is no trial, Aaron," Lisa said quietly. Her voice was perfectly calm, devoid of the anger that had consumed her the night before. She didn't feel hatred anymore. She just felt pity. "A trial is for disputes. There is no dispute here. You hid my father's will, you stole the Pack's funds, and you sold your alpha to a rival territory." Aaron sneered. "I am the alpha. I hold the title." "Not anymore." Lisa pressed her hand against the reinforced glass. She let her wolf rise to the surface, her gray eyes flashing with a sudden, brilliant gold luminescence. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of a true-born pack leader flooded the corridor. Inside the cell, Caleb whimpered and slid off the bench, instinctively dropping to his knees, his forehead pressing against the cold floor in total submission. Aaron choked, gripping the bars, his knees buckling as his own wolf was violently forced to recognize its rightful master. "By the blood of our ancestors and the charter of Crescent Ridge," Lisa proclaimed, her voice echoing off the concrete walls with absolute authority. "I, Lisa, true heir of the Ridge, strip you of your rank. I strip you of your titles. I strip you of your right to run with the Pack." Aaron was hyperventilating now, staring at her in sheer terror. She wasn't just taking his title. She was formally severing his connection to the Pack's spiritual network. It was the highest form of punishment, short of execution. "You can't do this," he gasped. "The Border, the Obsidian Pack will slaughter us without a strong leader." "The Obsidian Pack," David finally spoke, his deep voice slicing through the air, "stands entirely behind its queen." He reached out and took Lisa's hand, intertwining their fingers in front of the glass. Aaron stared at their joined hands, the horrifying realization dawning on him. He hadn't sold his sister to a monster. He had delivered his sister directly to her mate, effectively uniting the two most powerful packs in the region against him. "Caleb," Lisa said, turning her attention to her younger brother on the floor. "You were weak. You followed Aaron because it was easy. You will return to Crescent Ridge. You will spend the next 10 years working in the border town soup kitchens and rebuilding the clinics you let fall into ruin. If you step out of line, King David will personally see to your punishment." Caleb nodded frantically against the floor. "Yes. Yes, Alpha. Thank you. As for you," Lisa looked back at Aaron. Her expression was like carved marble. "You are exiled. You have no pack, no name, and no protection. You will be dropped at the Eastern Neutral Zone. If you ever set foot in Crescent Ridge or Obsidian territory again, you will be hunted down as a rogue." She didn't wait for his response. She turned on her heel and walked away. David fell into step beside her. The heavy steel doors of the holding sector hissed shut behind them, sealing Aaron's fate and ending a decade of lies. Later that evening, Lisa stood on the balcony of the penthouse. The winter air was sharp and biting, but she didn't feel the cold. The heavy coat draped over her shoulders smelled of cedar and smoke. David stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head as they looked out over the sprawling, glittering metropolis of the Obsidian Pack, and the dark, forested mountains of Crescent Ridge looming in the distance. Elias dispatched the relief convoys an hour ago, David murmured into her hair. And Caleb is on his way to the border towns under guard. It's done. It's just beginning, Lisa corrected softly, resting her hands over his. She wasn't a hostage anymore. She wasn't a pawn, and she wasn't hiding. She was a queen, standing beside her king, ready to heal the fractured lands her brother had broken. Then we begin together, David promised, turning her in his arms and kissing her deeply beneath the winter stars, the phantom in his dreams finally. Perfectly real. The story of Lisa and King David ends here, with the usurper exiled and two powerful packs united through a bond of destiny and resilience. If you enjoyed this cinematic tale of betrayal, undeniable mate bonds, and a woman claiming her rightful crown against all odds, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep bringing you intense, dramatic, and emotionally resonant modern romances. Drop a comment below and let us know what your favorite twist was and what kind of story you'd like to see next.